Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. This is Hamza again, and today we're going to talk about Andalusia, or Islamic Spain. And this is the 7th lecture, so we're already more than halfway done with the series here. And do be sure to get your final paper proposal in if you haven't already. أهلا وسهلا السلام عليكم يا طلاب العلم. So these are three major figures from Andalusian history. You have Ibn Hazm, who is featured in this Spanish stamp. And Ibn Hazm, he was a major scholar in the Zahiri madhab that we've talked about before. And the interesting thing about Ibn Hazm is he did not start out as a Zahiri. In fact, he started out as a Maliki, Ash'ari kind of philosophy style, typical scholar in the style of Islamic Spain. Most of them, they were philosopher jurists who followed the Maliki madhab. Sorry about that. Many of them were philosopher jurists who followed the Maliki madhab. And because of that, they were very, what you call in Arabic as muta'assub. Muta'assub means that you're very bigoted in your one particular madhab or way of thinking, to the point where you become overzealous and you have a closed mind. You think all the other madhabs are wrong, all the other schools of Sunni theology are wrong, etc., etc. And Ibn Hazm, he broke away from that type of mentality that was quite common in Islamic Spain and decided to become a Zahiri and follow the Hadith and his own conscience. There's a very famous book that's been translated into English from him called Tawqa Hamama, or the dove's ring, the dove's necklace, the dove's crown, sometimes it's translated as. And in the English edition, there's a kind of like biography of Ibn Hazm that you can find that'll detail how he converted from the Maliki madhab over to the Zahiri madhab. And he died in 1064 Gregorian. Then you had Ibn Rushd, who was a major philosopher. And we mentioned before that Imam al-Ghazali was the premier scholar of the Seljuk Sultanate. And one of the things that Imam al-Ghazali did was he wrote this book, Maqasid al-Falasifa, the objectives or aims of the philosophers, and where he basically spelled out how, what their beliefs are, how they come to their conclusions, how they do philosophy. And then he wrote a second book after that, Tahafut al-Falasifa, Incoherence of the Philosophers, where he refutes all of their main points. And then Ibn Rushd, he wrote a refutation of Ghazali called Tahafut at-Tahafut. And so just keep that in mind, that he was refuting Ghazali and going with Greek philosophy. He also is known for his a very famous book. In English, they call it the Jurist's Primer. It's a 2-volume book that's used to train muftis. So Ibn Rushd was quite the jurist himself. And it's a comparative fiqh book that looks at the 4 madhabs we know today, as well as opinions from Imam Awza'i, Imam Layth, Sufyan al-Thawri, Abu Dawud al-Zahiri, and so on and so forth. I highly recommend you take a look at it. It's very easy to find English PDFs of that work. The Distinguished Jurist's Primer, I believe it's called. In Arabic, it's called Bidayat al-Mujtahid, or the beginning of becoming a jurist. So it's still a book that's used to train muftis to this day. even though Ibn Rushd's philosophy is rejected by Sunni scholars today. And then on the right hand side is Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, and Muhyiddin ibn Arabi is one of the top thinkers in the Islamic tradition, much like Ghazali. He might be, just second to Ghazali as far as the most famous and influential Islamic scholar of all time. And if you look here, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, he died on 1240, the year 1240 Gregorian, so he was after Ibn Rushd, and he was after Ibn Hazm. In fact, there's this very famous story where Muhyiddin ibn Arabi actually meets Ibn Rushd face to face and has an encounter. And I'm not going to give you any spoilers. You can Google that and look up, read about their encounter. It's a very, very funny, interesting story. And maybe funny is not the right word. It's a deep story. Um, but Ibn Arabi, he takes all of these different strains of thought that are going around in Andalusia, and he brings them all together and synthesizes them into one system. So Imam Ghazali was known as a great reviver or renewer because he brought all these disparate strains of Islamic thought together into one coherent worldview and system. Well, Ibn Arabi does the exact same thing, except from the Andalusian perspective. So he takes all the different traditions of thought in Andalusia, synthesizes them together in one coherent package. And the advantage that he had over Ghazali was that he had access to Ghazali and Ghazali's Ihya. And so he could take from not only all the trends going on in Andalusia, but he could get some inspiration also from what was going on in the Mashriq, or the Islamic East, the traditional Middle East, if you will. The Fatimids were in between Islamic Spain and the Seljuks and did not allow too much travel or commerce to go in between. So the spread of ideas was kind of slowed down and hampered by the Fatimid presence. So that's just something important to keep in mind, that really what was going on in Andalusia and what was going on in the Middle East, for the most part, was pretty unrelated. They were on very different trajectories of Islamic thought. But then the Fatimids fell due to the Ayyubids, Salahuddin Ayyubi, and they became reunited once again. And this happened during Ibn Arabi's lifetime, and so Ibn Arabi himself will travel from Islamic Spain through Egypt and end up settling in Damascus after making Hajj. He settles in Damascus, Dimashq, where he is still buried to this day. There's a masjid there that's simply called Masjid Ibn Arabi, and the Imam of Masjid Ibn Arabi is Sheikh Samir al-Nas, who you can Google. I've had the pleasure to study with that sheikh on numerous occasions and get many ijazas from him. And so Ibn Arabi is someone I've read quite a bit in published articles on, as you'll see. And I find him to be very fascinating. And his relationship with Ibn Taymiyyah, even though they never met in person, but Ibn Taymiyyah writes about Ibn Arabi as well. So Ibn Taymiyyah is another major scholar in our tradition, and any Sufi figure who came after Ibn Arabi had to mention him, deal with him, work with him, because Ibn Arabi, he wasn't a Sufi, he was a Mu'tabar, which is different, and you will see the difference if you read for the reading responses. but he brought the Mu'tabari type of thinking or system of thought over to the Islamic East, the traditional Middle East, the Mashriq. And it kind of created this buzz or revolution in the traditional Middle East where they were like, whoa, where did this guy come from? He has such out of the box thinking. And they embraced him wholeheartedly. And really, he didn't have out of the box thinking. It's just that people in the Middle East had no access to the thoughts that were going around in Andalusia. These things precede Ibn Arabi by centuries. He just, uh, you know, appropriated and adopted that which fit within his own worldview. And so that's enough on those three figures, and we're going to get into the nitty gritties of kind of how Spain was conquered by the Muslims. So, the conquest of Islamic Spain, or just Spain before it was Islamic, was really carried out by this guy, Musa ibn Nusayr, who was made governor of the Maghrib, meaning the Islamic West. And he conquered North Africa as far as the Tangier, or Tunja. And they kind of got close to Islamic Spain. And the Visigoths at the time, who were kind of like a Hun or barbarian type of conqueror, they had conquered Rome, and that's why Byzantium kind of rose to the occasion when classical Rome collapsed due to these different Gothic type of characters. And so the Visigoths, who were ruling Spain, essentially, more or less, I mean, they handed over the reign to the Amazigh soldiers, the Muslim soldiers. Amazigh was the Berber Moors who crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to get into the Iberian Peninsula. And so the Amazigh was headed by Tariq ibn Ziyad. And they say that the Strait of Gibraltar derives from the Arabic word Jabal al-Tariq, because Tariq was the guy leading the Amazigh, or Moorish, soldiers into southern Spain. And they continued to march north into the Iberian Peninsula, reaching southern France. And they did get pushed back a little bit, and they never, even though they were constantly attacking and raiding monasteries, Christian monasteries in southern France and northwestern Italy, they never really were able to advance on the territory very much. And it was a very present threat to the different popes that ruled during the time of Islamic Spain. Each pope kind of saw Islamic Spain as a threat, an encroachment on Christendom, and they considered fighting the Spanish Muslims as part of the Crusades. So they saw the Crusades as being fought on two different fronts, fighting the Spanish front, and then also fighting the Middle Eastern front to get Jerusalem. So they had both ambitions to get Jerusalem and Spain back under Christian control. But they couldn't really make any advances on Islamic Spain, and so much of the European angst was directed towards Jerusalem because they saw it as a less defended and easier target. Plus, of course, it had its religious significance. But they were trying from the very beginning to retake Spain. So it was a constant warfare and fighting until Spain was actually reconquered. And you had the Spanish Inquisition. So that's just important to keep in mind, that this was a place where there was constant battling going on in the northern part of Islamic Spain. Like what their status quo or modus operandi, it was just warfare and fighting and skirmishing with Christians in the north. So that's something important to consider. It's kind of what made the system work. It's how people got their war booty and their incomes, serving for the army and various things such as that. It was also this great intellectual center where many different ideas were shared, and you had people of all different kinds of religions exchanging ideas, and it was a commercial center. Islamic Spain was one of the bridges between not only the Islamic world and the Christian world, but also Africa and Europe. And so quite a lot of trading or the exchange of goods happened in Islamic Spain. It was probably the most cosmopolitan place in the world at that time. So it was a very unique place to be, whereas the traditional Middle East was kind of, in many ways, becoming culturally backwards. Save for Imam Ghazali's contributions and the contributions of the select ulama who were making contributions during that time, but noticeably intellectual production seemed to slow down amongst Sunnis in the Mashriq, whereas in Andalusia it seemed like there was a lot more scholarly production going on. Much of it is still little understood. Many of these manuscripts still sit in European libraries, and there's certain Islamic figures in Spanish history that we're learning about all over again. Kind of like lost Islamic history, if you will. One of those figures is Ibn Dihaq. You can try to Google whatever you can find on Ibn Dihaq, and that's Dihaq, Ibn Dihaq. And I've worked on some of these manuscripts in my master's program before. So, it's very, very interesting just kind of how little understood Islamic Spain is still now by Muslim and non-Muslim historians. So it's very very ripe area to research if you ever do want to become a researcher. But basically, Tariq ibn Ziyad was the one responsible for more or less the conquest of Spain and putting it into Muslim hands. You can click that link there to see, read the whole article in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And so the Umayyads, if you remember, they had to flee the Abbasid revolution. Many of them were killed. They did not make it out, but of the ones who did make it out, they decided to establish themselves as caliphs in Islamic Spain and kind of make that their refuge, a place that was far away from Abbasid persecution. However, they would be cut off from the rest of the Muslim world because of the Fatimids. But they did start up in 756 in Andalusia, and they did a pretty good job at creating a lot of political stability. In the year 1002, for instance, things were more or less fairly stable. That was Ibn Hazm's time, and it kind of became organized as an Arab ethno-state. And what I mean by that is that Arab elites were in control of the ruling or leadership or rulership of Islamic Spain, whereas the North African Berbers, the Moors, aka the Amazigh, were second-class citizens, lesser than the Arabs, according to the Umayyads, and we know how the Umayyads would treat people who were non-Arab during their dynasty in the Middle East. And they continued kind of that same mentality and attitude in Islamic Spain, which eventually brought their downfall because the Spanish converts to Islam did not take kindly, as they never do, to the fact that they were considered second-class citizens and that their conversions often weren't recognized, and so they were still paying jizya even though they had converted to Islam. The social mobility didn't exist even though you had converted to Islam. The income inequality was still worse than ever. So it eventually brought the downfall of Islamic Spain. But the Umayyads themselves didn't last long, but the later dynasties would kind of keep this sort of Muslim or Arab supremacy, if you will. But people got pretty fed up with the Umayyads and their basically racism, and so they did not last all that long. And so the Umayyads were fighting this group called Banu Qasi. And Banu Qasi was like a whole tribe or clan that was revolting against the Umayyads from northern Spain. And they were apparently a Muslim group. They were led by Umar ibn Hafsun. And they fought for quite a long time. And the Muwallid is another word for Mozarab. Mozarab and Muwallid both kind of more or less mean the same thing, and that is that you were Spanish in descent and converted to Islam. So all of these Spanish converts were quite upset and aligned themselves with Banu Qasi in order to fight the Umayyads. And even though Banu Qasi was eventually defeated, later on, this man by the name of Ibn Qasi would come to lead a revolt as well. And he was an Islamic scholar who wrote books, and he was one of the early figures of the Mu'tabirun movement. And the Mu'tabirun movement, if you want to know more about it, you'd have to read the reading response. But it was this kind of slightly philosophical, spiritual, or mystical way of interpreting Islam. And so it says here he was a Sufi. Sufi isn't the right word, like I mentioned earlier, although you'll often see people calling Mu'tabar people as Sufis, but the Mu'tabirun were not Sufis. They rejected the term Sufi. He was also a jihadi, or a mujahid, who fought against the Almoravid dynasty that we'll get to in a minute. And like I said, he was Muwallid, or Spanish. So he was European. And so some people called him Rumi al-Asl, meaning originally European. And at one point he was a government official in this town Silves or Silves, and he was very, how would you call it? He was like a philanthropist, where he would donate a lot of his money to charity. And he was a murid, and a murid is someone who was kind of very interested in the Sufi kind of mystical aspects. But of course, like I said, there wasn't a Sufi movement in Andalusia, but so I'm not sure this word murid. I doubt you'll find it in any of Ibn Qasi's books or any of the books of Andalusians. This is what people in the Eastern Islamic lands would have described it as, that he was some sort of spiritual aspirant, someone who followed a spiritual type of sheikh or mystical sheikh. Um, and this would be allegedly Khalifullah al-Andalusi and Khalil. And he also probably met Ibn al-Arif, and you'll learn about Ibn al-Arif in the reading response if you decide to do that. And he was very influenced by this book called The Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, and the works of Ghazali, like Ihya Ulumuddin. And remember, Ghazali died in 1111, and Ibn Qasi died 1151. So Ibn Qasi was like from the generation after Ghazali, but they were alive at the same time. And so he was probably quite familiar with Ghazali's works. And they didn't really come to Islamic Spain till a little bit later. So probably during Ibn Qasi's, you could say, apex as a scholar is when Ghazali's works were at their high point of popularity in Islamic Spain as well. And the Brethren of Purity, it's known in Arabic as Ikhwan al-Safa. Ikhwan al-Safa was this Neoplatonic text where they took Neoplatonic philosophy and interpreted it through an Islamic lens. And it talks about every different kind of subject of human knowledge. And sometimes you'll see it rendered as Encyclopedia of the Brethren of Purity. And that's a translation of Rasail Ikhwan al-Safa. And I had the pleasure to read this text in Egypt with some Arabic teachers, and I found it very beneficial. It's a very interesting text. It has been translated into English. If you decide you want to go and read it or do a final paper regarding Ikhwan al-Safa, I would highly recommend that, the Brethren of Purity. And because it was highly influential in Islamic Spain, it was highly influential amongst Ismailis and many others. And so Ibn Qasi, he was kind of like a rebel or revolutionary, different from other Islamic scholars like Ibn Masarra, Ibn Barrajan, and Ibn Arif. Those you can learn more about in the reading response. So Ibn Masarra, Ibn Barrajan, Ibn Arif, they were quietist, or they didn't engage in any rebellion or fighting against the state, whereas Ibn Qasi did. And he's known for leading a revolt, a group of people that were called Muridiyya. And like I said, I don't know if this Muridiyya group is mentioned really in the primary text from Islamic Spain. I think they're used by Eastern Islamic writers describing the events. I'm not a specialist in Islamic Spain, so I could be wrong on that point, but that is my strong suspicion. And so he was very controversial during his time. So he was known by the state jurist establishment as someone who is souring corruption, possessing the minds of the ignorant, claiming sainthood, the title of Imam and Mahdi. And so they were making all these kinds of propaganda against him, when really he was kind of like Robin Hood, fighting for the lowly class of people, the Spaniard converts to Islam. And he would later join the Almohads in conquering Andalus from the Almoravids. But then he would actually rebel against the Almohads as well, with the help of this Christian king of Portugal, Alfonso Henrique. And eventually he was killed by his own followers because they thought that he was, excuse me, they thought that he was too close to this Christian king, um, Alfonso Henrique. And so he was killed, and beheaded, and his head put on this lance, or the spear that was given to him as a gift by um, Alfonso Henrique. So just keep that in mind. He had a very tumultuous history, but I find him to be a very interesting figure. And he has this famous book. Not much scholarship or research has been done on it, called Khul al-Na'alain wal-I'tibas al-Nur min Mawdi' al-Qadamain. And that means discarding the two shoes and borrowing light from the sight of the 2 feet. And it's very influenced by this earlier figure, Ibn Masarra. And Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who's also known as Sheikh al-Akbar, he became familiar with the text when he met Ibn al-Qasi's son in Tunisia in 1194. So his son had left Islamic Spain and went to Tunisia. And this area between Tunisia and Islamic Spain was very porous, very fluid. People traveled in between Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, all the time, as well as Islamic Spain. It kind of made this L shape of Sunni territory that people went back and forth. And they also, Sicily was part of that as well. They were also sailing ships in the Mediterranean. So those places were easy access to travel between one another. The problem is when you got to Egypt, it was ruled by this Shi'i Fatimid dynasty that was hostile against all of these Sunni polities in Islamic Spain. And so Ibn Arabi would go on to write a commentary, a sharh, on this text, Khal' al-Na'alain, and he referred to Ibn al-Qasi as a blind follower, a muqallid, an ignoramus, a jahil, an impostor, a transmitter of texts, but not someone who doesn't have understanding of them. However, he did think that he had kashf, or he had gotten some sort of divine unveiling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's different from revelation. I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole can of worms. But Ibn Arabi did basically use his text, comment on it, say what was good and bad about it, kind of like writing a book review of it. You could think of it that way, but explaining where he went right and where he went wrong. And like I said, the Umayyads didn't really last long in Islamic Spain, and it was the Murabitun, also known as the Almoravids, who were to conquer Islamic Spain from the Umayyads. So even though it was already a Muslim ruler, the Umayyads were doing a very poor job, and the Almoravids, coming out of Africa, North Africa again, went and deposed the Umayyad Caliph and basically took over. And the Umayyads in Spain had a rivalry with the Abbasids. Obviously, the Abbasids did depose them, and they had to run away to Islamic Spain. And so they kind of set themselves up as rivals or equal competitors with the Abbasids. But their rule over time kind of slowly disintegrated into quarreling city-states. Um, Singular is Ta'ifa, like the city Ta'if in Arabia between Mecca and Medina. Ta'ifa refers to a city state, and Tawa'if is the plural. And so the Tawa'if were fighting one another. It was becoming chaotic. The Christians started to encroach on Muslim territory in Spain. And so the Almoravids stepped in and decided to take control over Islamic Spain and defended against the Christian encroachment. And they were an Amazigh-led operation. So that instantly made them different from the Umayyads, who were these kind of Arab elitists, and the Almoravid, they were ruled by Yusuf ibn Tashufin. And Tashufin, if you know any Berber languages, is a very, very Berber sounding name. So Yusuf ibn Tashufin was their leader and conquered Islamic Spain, and essentially united many of the different Tawa'ifs, or the Ta'ifas, and was able to unite Islamic Spain under Almoravid rule. And it's very important to know what this word Murabit means. Murabit is the singular, Murabitun is the plural, but Ribat, as it's known, means that you're stationed on the front lines of Islam as a soldier defending the borders against the onslaught of the kuffar. And so Murabit is kind of like a mujahid, but it's more specific in the sense that it means that you're directly on the front line, in the battle zone, in the war zone, in like the demilitarized DMZ between South and North Korea. Um, that we have the phrase in English, behind enemy lines. It kind of has that connotation where if you're a Murabit, you're a tough soldier on the front line. And in the American military system, the Marines are considered the toughest of all the military branches. And the Marines are usually sent in before the Army to clean up shop. The Marines are the ones who do the real cold-blooded killing, assassination, and destruction of infrastructure. And they take out the other military targets in the initial sweep. Whereas the Army comes in kind of as a secondary backup force to not only assist the Marines in this initial wave, but they also become then the maintaining force of that territory. So it's kind of a misconception that the Army is kind of the first one sent into battle. That is not usually the case. And it all depends, of course, on many different circumstances. But in other words, this title that they used for themselves, Al-Murabitun, meant a very serious thing, that these people are serious warriors. They are not to be reckoned with. They are specialist fighters, if you will, and they're going to come in and they're going to clean up shop. So it's kind of almost like a horror kind of name, in a sense that it was meant to instill fear into the people. So that's just something important to keep in mind, and that the Almoravids, that name has kind of it has a lot of baggage. And then they were later deposed by the Almohads. And Almohad is in Arabic Al-Muwahidun. and that means the monotheists, the people who had tawheed, right? The muwahidun, singular is muwahid. And so that's also a very hypercharged name, not for any military reason, but for religious reasons. These were the people who were going to bring true Islam back to Islamic Spain, because the Al-Murabitun had gone astray. And so Ibn Tumart, who's also in the reading response articles, Ibn Tumart, he was a Berber who kind of started the Al-Muwahidun movement, and his successor was this guy, Abd al-Mu'min. And Abd al-Mu'min, from what I understand, is the one who carried out the conquest of Islamic Spain away from the Almoravids, and the Almohads had won the day. And they assumed the title of Caliph. They were trying to be a rival caliphate again to the Abbasids, even though the Abbasids were Caliph by title only. And because they had this, they were known as kind of religious fundamentalists, if you will. As soon as Al-Muwahidun got into power, they kind of put in a series of strict or severe religious rulings or rules, and they wanted to unify everybody on religious lines in order to kind of make a cohesive state, people who will be more subservient to their political leaders. So they were doing this more for political, ideological, propaganda type reasons. And they were trying to get Jews and Christians to either convert or leave. So they were starting to take away from this culture of cosmopolitanism and intellectualism, diverse commercial trade, and all those types of things. They were kind of started to ruin that by putting these kind of what I would call hyper-Islamic rules in place. They go beyond what traditional ulama would advocate. They go astray from the middle path and from a balance, and they kind of become these religious fundamentalists who were trying to kind of combat the more philosophical bent Malikis like Ibn Rushd, but they still maintained some of it, and they wanted to bring more hadith scholarship into the Maliki madhab. So they were kind of instituting these new policies as well as rules on the ground like hijab and different things of that nature. And they reigned over Islamic Spain for quite some time, and eventually, though, they did fall to the Christians in 1492, and Christopher Columbus shortly thereafter would sail to the Americas. And the Muslims who did stay behind, even though there was an Inquisition, who did fake conversions to Christianity, were known as the Mudahars or Moriscos. And they practiced their religion in secret, many of them, until Islam was no longer illegal or outlawed, and then they started practicing publicly. And there's documentaries about that. Some of them are in English, most of them are in Spanish, but that is something that you can look into, is kind of the Morisco religion and how they preserved Islam in secret. And there were fatwas that allowed them to do that. And so that I find very interesting, but that's basically the Muwahidun in summation.
For this, there was a new invention, one that is still fundamental to learning and knowledge today: paper.
Around the year 700, 750, when Muslim armies reached Central Asia, they encountered paper for the first time. And very quickly, the Muslim bureaucracy started using paper. You find that, within 50 years it's in Syria, and then a few years after that it's in Egypt, and then it's in North Africa, and then it's in Sicily, and then it's in Spain, and that's where Europe learned to make paper from. They learned to make it from the Arabs.
We begin to have people with family names like papermaker. So in other words, it not only that paper was available, it must have become a very, very widespread industry. And hence, the acquisition of books must have also become very easy.
With the wide use of books and paper, hundreds of scribes, some of whom were women, were kept busy transcribing the translations and new writings of the Baghdad scholars.
All of this knowledge that's being acquired from the Greeks and from the Indians and from Central Asia and stuff is all being written down in books on paper, and that these books are being copied and recopied and sent around. We know, for example, that there was a street of booksellers with more than 100 shops, each one with paper and books for sale. And this is a time when, in Europe, a monastery would be lucky if it had 5 or 10 books.
While the monks of the West were hoarding their wisdom on scraps of expensive parchment, paper enabled Islamic civilization to spread its newfound knowledge far and wide, creating a single community linking 3 continents.
So the chief distinction, therefore, of Islamic civilization, in addition to the fact that it made new leaps of originality, new transformations in traditions of learning and everything else possible, is the fact that it enabled human beings to consider the possibility of thinking about the globe as a single unit, humanity.
In all the broad empire, there was one place the Christian world could experience the lifestyle Muslims now took for granted: southern Spain. Here, on the European continent itself, Islamic culture would begin to have an effect on the European civilization around it. 1,000 years ago, the Spanish city of Cordoba was a center of learning and culture that rivaled Baghdad. Today, Cordoba's narrow lanes hearken to its medieval past. During the Dark Ages, this was the most prosperous and sophisticated metropolis on the continent. It had streetlights and paved roads, libraries, hospitals and palaces. This was a city of light, a Muslim city.
The city of Cordoba in the 9th and 10th centuries was one of the biggest and most exciting in Europe. We have descriptions of it by people coming and saying, all these flowers everywhere, this open streets, this wonderful light coming down. Northern cities were dark. Cordoba had running water. People lived in big houses. In contrast, in Paris, people lived in shacks by the side of the river.
The glory of medieval Cordoba is here, in what is now the great Roman Catholic Cathedral in the middle of town. But the Cordoba Cathedral of today began its life as a mosque, one of the grandest of the Islamic Empire.
The Great Mosque in Cordoba was simply the biggest mosque in the biggest city in southern Europe.
When you climb up into the church tower, which used to be a minaret, you look out over this expanse of roof, it's quite amazing to see this cathedral, complete with flying buttresses, popping up out of the middle of this massive mosque.
Many people came to visit it to view the wonders of the mosque, which had rib vaulting, the kind of vaulting which is like this, and which 100 years later, by a mere coincidence you might think, but not at all a coincidence, appears in the Gothic cathedrals of Northern Europe, in Lincoln Cathedral, in Chartres Cathedral in France. Where does that come from? Obviously influenced by the great Mosque of Cordoba in the south of Spain.
For the occasional European Christian traveller, Cordoba was their one opportunity to glimpse the Islamic world. What they saw was shocking. Most of Europe at that time languished in poverty and squalor. Cordoba was a pageant of prosperity and enlightenment.
In the 10th century, there was a Saxon nun with the unpronounceable name of Hrotswitha, who called medieval Cordoba the ornament of the world. She was very, very taken with the place, and there you are, she's a Christian nun.
As Europeans made their way from the cold stone of their northern castles into the glorious Muslim cities of southern Spain, they couldn't help but be impressed. In the green hills above Granada was a palace of startling elegance, a shining example of the richness and sophistication Islam brought to medieval Europe. It is called the Alhambra.
The Alhambra is perhaps the most famous example of Islamic architecture to most Westerners. It is the best remaining example of what a medieval Muslim palace would have looked like.
Echoed in the finely carved geometric plasterwork and marble pillars is a vanished lifestyle of extraordinary luxury. The Alhambra reveals the pinnacle of Islamic culture and urbanity.
The beauty of the Alhambra is not so much in the individual details. No, it's more the combination of everything. That is, this wonderful sort of orchestrated interplay of different textures and surfaces, of light and space and water playing inside and outside of buildings. It's almost like a symphony of different elements that are very carefully brought together to provide exquisite enjoyment.
Here, the Muslim elite relished the good life. Reposing on lush carpets, surrounded by perfume and music, the privileged few debated the nature of God, the subtleties of Greek philosophy, or the most recent mathematical revelations from India, while they dined on spiced delicacies served on Chinese porcelains. They strolled the grounds through gardens irrigated by complex gravity-fed water systems. How far Muhammad's followers had come from the life of desert nomads. How distant they felt from the rest of the European continent they now shared. Christian Europe, due north, was struggling on through the Dark Ages.
In the 7th century AD, a new force arose in the Arabian Peninsula that would reach out to change the entire known world. Introduced by the Prophet Muhammad, the faith of Islam drew the people of Arabia together in the belief in one God. By the time the Prophet died in 632, Islam had spread across the entire Arabian Peninsula. Inspired and united by their vital new faith, these Muslims began to spread it to neighboring countries. In 5 years, the Arabs controlled Damascus. A year later, they had captured Jerusalem. Everywhere they went, they found oppressed and overtaxed people, eager for a better government and hungry for something to believe in. People who became enthusiastic new converts to the Arab cause. The teachings of the Islamic Holy Scripture, the Quran, about justice, charity, and equality among men, gave these people finer ideas than any they had known. It won their loyalty away from the individual tribe to the greater community of the faithful. By 651 AD, they had easily overcome the corrupt and decaying Byzantine and Persian empires, and shortly spread the word through the Egyptian, Libyan, and Tunisian countrysides. The nomadic Berbers of North Africa fought them hard, but in their defeat, finally embraced Islam too. By 705, with all North Africa under Arab control, the Muslim forces stood just 13 miles across the water from Spain. In 711, General Tariq crossed the strait and landed on the rock that still bears his name, Jabal Tariq, or Gibraltar. At the time, Spain was ruled by the Visigoths, a Germanic people who had taken over after the fall of the Roman Empire. Tariq took the bulk of his army toward Toledo, the Visigoth capital, while sending detachments against neighboring towns. The Arabs continued to sweep on through Spain. In one summer, they had taken half of the peninsula, and within 5 years controlled almost the entire country, leaving the Visigoths only a tiny stronghold in the north. Spain had become a province of the Caliphate. The Arabic name it was given was Al-Andalus. In 732, almost 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, an Arab army reached the city of Tours in France. The domain of the successors of the Prophet Muhammad had become a world empire extending from Europe to China. Contrary to the commonly held myth of the fanatical warrior of Islam, Arabs practiced a religious tolerance remarkable for any age. Christian and Jewish communities were left unmolested because in the eyes of the followers of the Quran, they, like themselves, were people of the book. To many historians, the Arab conquest was a great gift to Spain and to the world. It broke the power of the privileged groups, including the nobility and the clergy. It ameliorated the conditions of the lowest class and restored to the Christian landowner the property he was denied under the Visigoths. Bringing the arts and sciences from the Muslim world, the Arabs made living in the cities of their new country delightful. They constructed thousands of mosques, bridges, palaces, and imposing castles. They started the beautification of cities like Toledo, Cordoba, Seville, Granada, Malaga, Almeria, Valencia. They also struck coins, organized a postal service, and raised city life to a level of culture and comfort unknown in the rest of Europe. The mosque was the heart of the Muslim city. No effort was spared to make it an impressive structure. It was not only a place of worship, but was used for teaching and the administration of justice. The great mosque of Cordoba was built with the finest materials from all over the world. It had 1,200 pillars supporting 2 tiers of arches, which in turn supported the dome. Around the mosque was the marketplace. Luxury goods from the far corners of the world could be found there, as well as many of the fine products of Al-Andalus. Textiles and brocades from wool, cotton, and silk were woven there. Carpets were everywhere in use in the Arab world, yet they were not to be found in Europe until some centuries later. Cordoba, the chosen capital, soon became the most populous and certainly the most splendid city in all Europe. Spaniards, dazzled by the glamour of the Arab civilization, its art, poetry, philosophy, and science, soon began to adopt the Arab way of living. The Christian converts were called Muzarabs. The Muzarabs carried these and other architectural features developed in Cordoba to Toledo and other northern centers. The city enjoyed miles of paved roads illuminated by streetlights. It was clean and bright, whereas even 700 years later, there was not one such public lamp in London. And in Paris, it was said, whoever stepped over his threshold on a rainy day stepped up to his ankles in mud. Arab houses with windowless exterior walls faced an inner courtyard which usually contained a pool or fountain and a small garden. This design kept the temperature even and cool. Making the streets narrow shaded the houses. Under Arab rule, Cordoba at its height was the most cultured city in Europe and the world ornament. Philosophers, astronomers, mathematicians, physicians, scientists, musicians, and poets chose the city for their capital. Noble Christian families sent their sons there to be educated at the university, while the rest of Europe still lived in superstition and ignorance. An example of the university is still to be found in Morocco. An inscription commonly found on its walls was this: "The world is supported by 4 things: the learning of the wise, the justice of the great, the prayers of the righteous, and the valor of the brave." Education was based on the Holy Quran. Schools taught reading, writing, grammar, and poetry from its pages. The Arabic language was used throughout Spain and was a factor in holding the nation together. Most Christians were bilingual, speaking both Arabic and their native Romance language. Some of the rulers patronized learning. Al-Hakam, for example, granted generous scholarships and established 27 free schools in the capital. Under him, the University of Cordoba, founded by Caliph Abdul Rahman III, rose to a preeminent place among educational institutions. Al-Hakam was also a book lover. His agents searched the bookshops of Alexandria, Damascus, and Baghdad with a view to buying or copying manuscripts. His library is said to have numbered 400,000 titles. Muslim physicians were far ahead of those in the rest of Europe in medical knowledge. They regarded it as a science that could be advanced by observation, while their northern neighbors saw illness as the will of God and looked to magic and prayer for cures. Doctors in Arab Spain were licensed and had a code of conduct. There was a public hospital in every town. Arab Tubibs founded the earliest school of pharmacy. Ibn al-Baybar, the botanist of Spain, brought Arab pharmacology to great heights, and it was here that he classified and listed the names and uses of more than 1,400 drugs derived from curative herbs and plants for medicine. When the Black Plague ravaged Europe in the later Middle Ages, 2 Arab doctors proposed the idea that the disease was caused by contamination and spread from person to person. Ailing monarchs of Europe sent to Cordoba for Arab doctors. Arab physicians published the earliest treatises on veterinary science, surgery, smallpox, dentistry, pediatrics, on abscess and cancer of the womb, treatises on the respiratory organs, on eye diseases and optics. Hunayn ibn Ishaq's book on eye treatment is the earliest known to include anatomical charts, and its influence on the development of ophthalmology was profound. Ibn Haytham's book on optics was recognized as the most important source in its field. He was called the father of optics. Eye specialists in modern Barcelona are still known as the best in Europe. Azarawi's book on surgery contained drawings of about 200 instruments that he himself had designed and became the basis for later European scientific advances. Al-Razi's medical books and Ibn Sina's The Rules of Medicine remain to this day unrivaled. Most of these books were translated into Latin and were the key works in the teaching of Arab medicine in Europe from the 9th to the 17th centuries. Arab astronomers perfected the astrolabe, an important measuring instrument used in astronomy and navigation. They measured the length of a terrestrial degree with the intent of determining the circumference and spherical nature of the Earth. In astrology, Ibn Mashar explains in a treatise the laws of tides in relation to the moon's rising and setting. Muslims composed the oldest book on arithmetic. Al-Khawarizmi, one of the greatest minds of Islam, invented algebra, meaning in Arabic the union of broken parts. Arabs also laid the foundation of analytic geometry. These influences are evident in the design arts. The introduction of Arabic numerals and the zero, or el-sifr, the very basis of modern arithmetic, was used by the Arabs 250 years before it reached Western Europe. It made possible mathematical solutions which could never have developed with Roman numerals. Philosophy, too, made great advances in spite of the repression from religious orthodoxy. 2 of Cordoba's philosophers, Ibn al-Rushd and Ibn al-Maymun, tried to reconcile the ideas of monotheistic religion based on faith with the ideas of Greek philosophy based on reason. The commentaries of Ibn al-Rushd upon Aristotle were widely read in Europe and influenced many Christian thinkers, including Thomas Aquinas. Between the middle of the 8th and the beginning of the 13th centuries, the Arabic-speaking peoples were the main torchbearers of culture and civilization throughout the world. Moreover, they were the means by which ancient science and philosophy made possible the Renaissance of Western Europe. In this, Arab Spain had a large share. The Arabs understood the importance of agriculture to the economy of their nation, and brought the fields and orchards to new heights of productivity. They introduced the water wheel. Some types were turned by human or animal power, but one ingenious type used the current of the river itself to turn the wheel and lift the water up to the field. Such wheels are still in use today. They built an extensive irrigation system and used sophisticated surveying methods to make their fields level and thus easier to water. Al-Filaha, written by Ibn al-Wan, the famous botanist of Seville, is the most important and outstanding Islamic work on agriculture. The book treats 585 plants and explains the cultivation of more than 50 fruit trees. It presents new observations on grafting and the properties of the soil and manure, and discusses the symptoms of several diseases of trees and vines, suggesting cures. Immigrants from the Middle East introduced oranges, lemons, pomegranates, date palms, rice, cotton, sugar, almonds, and many other kinds of crops. They introduced intensive organic farming using manure and managed the land more efficiently than the Romans or the Visigoths had. In many cases, land that had been harvested only once a year before the arrival of the Muslims began to produce 2 or 3 times a year. Unlike the Christians of the time who believed that virtue would be rewarded only in heaven, in everyday life Muslims believe that the faithful should be rewarded on earth and should enjoy the good things of life here and now. The best of this heaven-on-earth paradise in Spain is seen in Alhambra, the red, from the color of the bricks of which its outer walls are built. This fairy tale palace of truly oriental splendor is considered the pearl of Arab architecture in Spain. Here all kinds of decorative elements were brought into play with eloquent skill and refinement. The chief designer of the Nasrid dynasty who built Alhambra wished to give a place in the palace to all the decorative elements traditionally used in the Umayyad, Abbasid, Fatimid and Seljuk periods. The coat of arms of the Nasrids, with the motto "No victor but God," played an important part in the palace decorations. It was a victorious Muhammad al-Ghalib, cheered by the crowds on his return to Granada, who coined the motto. The Arabs regarded their language as their most precious possession. Sayings in the beautifully fluid script were often used to decorate buildings. In this palace, members of the best society were expert in the art of gracious and luxurious living. Their conversations were witty and intellectual. The recitation of poetry or the improvisation of verses suited to the occasion was a pastime in which the members of society were expected to be competent. Here, sweet drink was served in cups of gold and silver or in finely cut glass. An orchestra provided a musical background, or a beautiful girl sang to the lute or ode. The elegant taste and customs of the court of Baghdad, introduced by Ziryad 3 centuries before to the Umayyad capital of Cordoba, were followed here in Alhambra. And in Granada, too, there existed an institute of beauty, a calendar of fashion which became the arbiter not only of what should be worn, but what should be eaten. Bathing and cleanliness were an important part of life to the Andalusians. In this example in Alhambra, it is said that the lords were entertained by blind musicians while they washed. Arab civilization at its height devoted a great attention to music. The Conservatory of Andalusian Music was opened in Cordoba during the 9th century. Other schools followed in Seville, Toledo, Valencia, and Granada. The telling of romantic stories had always been a favorite Arab diversion, one indeed to which Western European literature owes an immense debt. Through ballads and love songs was manifested a tender chivalry. The voice was more appreciated than the orchestra, partly because it could combine music and poetry, both much loved by the Arabs. Spanish music bears the influence today, as one can hear in these two selections, the first an old Arab song, the second from modern Spain. Although it is now nearly 500 years since the Arabs left Spain, their enormous influence is incalculable. Spaniards today use some 4,000 words of Arabic origin in their daily conversation, and many other words have found their way into other European languages. The cry of Olé, for example, is derived directly from the Arabic Ya Allah, meaning for the sake of God. If you order coffee with sugar in a bar, you will be using Arabic words. Traffic is an Arabic word. Buy a gold ring and ask how many carats it is, and again you will be using an Arabic word. The check, a bill of exchange, also derives from the Arabic. Many common foods, rice, lemon, spinach, artichoke, apricot, were also introduced to Europe by the Arabs. The word makhazin, meaning a storehouse for goods and munitions in Arabic, became magazine in French and magazine in English. The faces of Spanish people today reflect their Arabic ancestry. Arab blood still runs in the veins of many Spaniards, especially in the south. The Spanish language has preserved several architectural terms of Arabic origin. The Arab style is still evident all over the country. In the hands of Muslim builders who preferred to remain in Spain, Oriental art, mingled with the Spanish and called mudahar, attained great beauty and perfection, and became the Spanish national style. Architecture in Spain, right to the present, shows great influence of Arabic style. The familiar arches, the lovely patios with their fountains and flowers, all reflect an Arabic touch. The beautiful tiles called azulejos are still made and used. But the greatest gift of the Arabs to modern Spain remains Alhambra, the jewel of the country. It has inspired travelers and poets for many centuries. Some writers call Alhambra the most marvelous building that exists in the world, and the most precious example of Arab art existing in Spain. This splendid palace has become a center for pilgrims from all over the world. In every language, visitors remark upon its beauty. For some, Alhambra has become an open-air university amphitheater in Muslim art studies, a living source of inspiration. This woman has still to learn, though, that writing in Arabic proceeds from right to left. For some others, Alhambra is a place where they can escape the pressures of a mechanized world, among the fountains and gardens. After so many years of absence, Arabs are once again returning, now as vacationers. They come to see the marvels their ancestors accomplished during their tenure of nearly 800 years. This modern mosque, built by an Arab emir in Spain's Marbella, echoes the eloquent statement about a people who made great contributions to mankind in the past, and who have now returned to join the rest of the world in an intellectual partnership beneficial to all her future generations.